Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which the strength of a behavior is modified by the behavior's consequences, such as reward or punishment, and the behavior is controlled by antecedents called discriminative stimuli, which come to signal those consequences. While operant and classical conditioning both involve the presence of environmental stimuli, they differ in nature. In operant conditioning, stimuli present when a behavior is rewarded or punished come to control that behavior. For example, a child may learn to open a box to get the candy inside, or learn to avoid touching a hot stove. The box and the stove are discriminative stimuli. However, in classical conditioning, stimuli that signal significant events produces reflexive behavior. For example, the sight of a colorful wrapper comes to signal candy, causing a child to salivate, or the sound of a door slam comes to signal an angry parent, causing a child to tremble. The study of animal learning in the 20th century was dominated by the analysis of these two sorts of learning, and they are still at the core of behavior analysis. Historical note: Thorndike's law of effect. Operant conditioning, sometimes called instrumental learning, was first extensively studied by Edward L. Thorndike, who observed the behavior of cats trying to escape from homemade puzzle boxes. A cat could escape from the box by a simple response such as pulling a cord or pushing a pole, but when first constrained the cats took a long time to get out. With repeated trials, ineffective responses occurred less frequently and successful responses occurred more frequently, so the cats escaped more and more quickly. Thorndike generalized this finding in his law of effect, which states that behaviors followed by satisfying consequences tend to be repeated and those that produce unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. In short, some consequences strengthen behavior and some consequences weaken behavior. By plotting escape time against trial number, Thorndike produced the first known animal learning curves through this procedure. Humans appear to learn many simple behaviors through the sort of process studied by Thorndike, now called operant conditioning. That is, responses are retained when they lead to a successful outcome and discarded when they do not, or when they produce aversive effects. This usually happens without being planned by any teacher, but operant conditioning has been used by parents in teaching their children for thousands of years. Skinner B. F. Skinner is often referred to as the father of operant conditioning, and his work is frequently cited in connection with this topic. His book, The Behavior of Organisms, published in 1938, initiated his lifelong study of operant conditioning and its application to human and animal behavior. Following the ideas of Ernst Mach, Skinner rejected Thorndike's reference to unobservable mental states such as satisfaction, building his analysis on observable behavior and its equally observable consequences. To implement his empirical approach, Skinner invented the operant conditioning chamber, or Skinner box, in which subjects such as pigeons and rats were isolated and could be exposed to carefully controlled stimuli. Unlike Thorndike's puzzle box, this arrangement allowed the subject to make one or two simple, repeatable responses, and the rate of such responses became Skinner's primary behavioral measure. Another invention, the Cumulative Recorder, produced a graphical record from which these response rates could be estimated. These records were the primary data that Skinner and his colleagues used to explore the effects on response rate of various reinforcement schedules. A reinforcement schedule may be defined as any procedure that delivers reinforcement to an organism according to some well-defined rule. The effects of schedules became, in turn, the basic findings from which Skinner developed his account of operant conditioning. He also drew on many less formal observations of human and animal behavior. Many of Skinner's writings are devoted to the application of operant conditioning to human behavior. In 1948 he published Walden II, a fictional account of a peaceful, happy, productive community organized around his conditioning principles. In 1957, Skinner published Verbal Behavior, which extended the principles of operant conditioning to language, a form of human behavior that had previously been analyzed quite differently by linguists and others. Skinner defined new functional relationships such as mands and tacts to capture some essentials of language, but he introduced no new principles, treating verbal behavior like any other behavior controlled by its consequences, which included the reactions of the speaker's audience, concepts and procedures. Origins of operant behavior. Operant variability. Operant behavior is said to be emitted, that is, initially it is not elicited by any particular stimulus. Thus one may ask why it happens in the first place. The answer to this question is like Darwin's answer to the question of the origin of a new bodily structure, namely, variation and selection. Similarly, the behavior of an individual varies from moment to moment in such aspects as the specific motions involved, the amount of force applied, or the timing of the response. Variations that lead to reinforcement are strengthened, and if reinforcement is consistent, the behavior tends to remain stable. However, behavioral variability can itself be altered through the manipulation of certain variables. Modifying operant behavior. Reinforcement and shaping. Reinforcement and punishment are the core tools through which operant behavior is modified. These terms are defined by their effect on behavior. Either may be positive or negative, as described below. Positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement increase the probability of behavior that they follow, while positive punishment and negative punishment reduce the probability of behavior that they follow. There is an additional procedure. Extinction occurs when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced with either positive or negative reinforcement. During extinction, the behavior becomes less probable. Thus, there are a total of 5 basic consequences. Positive reinforcement. This occurs when a behavior is rewarding and the behavior is followed by another stimulus that is rewarding, increasing the frequency of that behavior. For example, if a rat in a Skinner box gets food when it presses a lever, its rate of pressing will go up. This procedure is usually called simply reinforcement. Negative reinforcement. This occurs when a behavior is followed by the removal of an aversive stimulus, thereby increasing that behavior's frequency. In the Skinner box experiment, the aversive stimulus might be a loud noise continuously sounding inside the box. Negative reinforcement would happen when the rat presses a lever, turning off the noise. Positive punishment. This occurs when a behavior is followed by an aversive stimulus, such as pain from a spanking, which results in a decrease in that behavior. Positive punishment is a rather confusing term, and usually the procedure is simply called punishment. Negative punishment occurs when a behavior is followed by the removal of a stimulus, such as taking away a child's toy following an undesired behavior, resulting in a decrease in that behavior. Extinction. This occurs when a behavior that had previously been reinforced is no longer effective. For example, a rat is first given food many times for lever presses. Then, in extinction, no food is given. Typically the rat continues to press more and more slowly and eventually stops, at which time lever pressing is said to be extinguished. It is important to note that actors are not spoken of as being reinforced, punished, or extinguished. It is the actions that are reinforced, punished, or extinguished. Also, reinforcement, punishment, and extinction are not terms whose use is restricted to the laboratory. Naturally occurring consequences can also reinforce, punish, or extinguish behavior and are not always planned or delivered by people. Factors that alter the effectiveness of reinforcement and punishment. The effectiveness of reinforcement and punishment can be changed in various ways. Satiation deprivation. The effectiveness of a positive or appetitive stimulus will be reduced if the individual has received enough of that stimulus to satisfy its appetite. The opposite effect will occur if the individual becomes deprived of that stimulus. The effectiveness of a consequence will then increase. If someone is not hungry, food will not be an effective reinforcer for behavior. Immediacy. An immediate consequence is more effective than a delayed consequence. If one gives a dog a treat for sitting right away, the dog will learn faster than if the treat is given later. Contingency. To be most effective, reinforcement should occur consistently after responses and not at other times. Learning may be slower if reinforcement is intermittent, that is, following only some instances of the same response. But responses reinforced intermittently are usually much slower to extinguish than responses that have always been reinforced. The size, or amount, of a stimulus often affects its potency as a reinforcer. Humans and animals engage in a sort of cost-benefit analysis. A tiny amount of food may not be worth an effortful lever press for a rat. A pile of quarters from a slot machine may keep a gambler pulling the lever longer than a single quarter. Most of these factors serve biological functions. For example, the process of satiation helps the organism maintain a stable internal environment. When an organism has been deprived of sugar, for example, the taste of sugar is a highly effective reinforcer. However, when the organism's blood sugar reaches or exceeds an optimum level, the taste of sugar becomes less effective, perhaps even aversive. Shaping is a conditioning method much used in animal training and in teaching nonverbal humans. It depends on operant variability and reinforcement, as described above. The trainer starts by identifying the desired final behavior. Next, the trainer chooses a behavior that the animal or person already emits with some probability. The form of this behavior is then gradually changed across successive trials by reinforcing behaviors that approximate the target behavior more and more closely. When the target behavior is finally emitted, it may be strengthened and maintained by the use of a schedule of reinforcement. Stimulus control of operant behavior. Though initially operant behavior is emitted without reference to a particular stimulus, during operant conditioning operants come under the control of stimuli that are present when behavior is reinforced. Such stimuli are called discriminative stimuli. A so-called three-term contingency is the result. That is, discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that produce reward or punishment. Thus, a rat may be trained to press a lever only when a light comes on. A dog rushes to the kitchen when it hears the rattle of its food bag. A child reaches for candy when she sees it on a table. Behavioral sequences, conditioned reinforcement and chaining. Most behavior cannot easily be described in terms of individual responses reinforced one by one. The scope of operant analysis is expanded through the idea of behavioral chains, which are sequences of responses bound together by the three-term contingencies defined above. Chaining is based on the fact, experimentally demonstrated, that a discriminative stimulus not only sets the occasion for subsequent behavior, but it can also reinforce behavior that precedes it. That is, a discriminative stimulus is also a conditioned reinforcer. For example, the light that sets the occasion for lever pressing may be used to reinforce turning around in the presence of a noise. This results in the sequence noise, turn around, light, press lever, food. Much longer chains can be built by adding more stimuli and responses. Escape and avoidance. In escape learning, a behavior terminates a stimulus. For example, shielding one's eyes from sunlight terminates the stimulation of bright light in one's eyes. Behavior that is maintained by preventing a stimulus is called avoidance, as, for example, putting on sunglasses before going outdoors. Avoidance behavior raises the so-called avoidance paradox. For it may be asked, how can the non-occurrence of a stimulus serve as a reinforcer? This question is addressed by several theories of avoidance. Two kinds of experimental settings are commonly used: discriminated and free operant avoidance learning. Discriminated avoidance learning. A discriminated avoidance experiment involves a series of trials in which a neutral stimulus such as a light is followed by an aversive stimulus, such as a shock. After the neutral stimulus appears, an operant response such as a lever press prevents or terminates the aversive stimulus. In early trials, the subject does not make the response until the aversive stimulus has come on, so these early trials are called escape trials. As learning progresses, the subject begins to respond during the neutral stimulus and thus prevents the aversive stimulus from occurring. Such trials are called avoidance trials. Quote, "This experiment is said to involve classical conditioning, because a neutral CS is paired with an aversive US. This idea underlies the two-factor theory of avoidance learning described below. Free operant avoidance learning. In free operant avoidance, a subject periodically receives an aversive stimulus unless an operant response is made. The response delays the onset of the shock. In this situation, unlike discriminated avoidance, no prior stimulus signals the shock. Two crucial time intervals determine the rate of avoidance learning. This first is the SS interval. This is time between successive shocks in the absence of a response. The second interval is the RS interval. This specifies the time by which an operant response delays the onset of the next shock. Note that each time the subject performs the operant response, the RS interval without shock begins anew. Two-process theory of avoidance. This theory was originally proposed in order to explain discriminated avoidance learning, in which an organism learns to avoid an aversive stimulus by escaping from a signal for that stimulus. Two processes are involved: classical conditioning of the signal followed by operant conditioning of the escape response. A classical conditioning of fear. Initially, the organism experiences the pairing of a CS with an aversive US. The theory assumes that this pairing creates an association between the CS and the US through classical conditioning, and, because of the aversive nature of the US, the CS comes to elicit a conditioned emotional reaction, fear. B. Reinforcement of the operant response by fear reduction. As a result of the first process, the CS now signals fear. This unpleasant emotional reaction serves to motivate operant responses, and responses that terminate the CS are reinforced by fear termination. Note that the theory does not say that the organism avoids the US in the sense of anticipating it, but rather that the organism escapes an aversive internal state that is caused by the CS. Several experimental findings seem to run counter to two-factor theory. For example, avoidance behavior often extinguishes very slowly even when the initial CS-US pairing never occurs again, so the fear response might be expected to extinguish. Further, animals that have learned to avoid often show little evidence of fear, suggesting that escape from fear is not necessary to maintain avoidance behavior. Operant or one-factor theory. Some theorists suggest that avoidance behavior may simply be a special case of operant behavior maintained by its consequences. In this view, the idea of consequences is expanded to include sensitivity to a pattern of events. Thus, in avoidance, the consequence of a response is a reduction in the rate of aversive stimulation. Indeed, experimental evidence suggests that a missed shock is detected as a stimulus and can act as a reinforcer. Cognitive theories of avoidance take this idea a step farther. For example, a rat comes to expect shock if it fails to press a lever and to expect no shock if it presses it, and avoidance behavior is strengthened if these expectancies are confirmed. Some other terms and procedures: non-contingent reinforcement. Non-contingent reinforcement is the delivery of reinforcing stimuli regardless of the organism's behavior. Non-contingent reinforcement may be used in an attempt to reduce an undesired target behavior by reinforcing multiple alternative responses while extinguishing the target response. As no measured behavior is identified as being strengthened, there is controversy surrounding the use of the term non-contingent reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement are rules that control the delivery of reinforcement. The rules specify either the time that reinforcement is to be made available, or the number of responses to be made, or both. Many rules are possible, but the following are the most basic and commonly used. Fixed interval schedule. Reinforcement occurs following the first response after a fixed time has elapsed after the previous reinforcement. Variable interval schedule. Reinforcement occurs following the first response after a variable time has elapsed from the previous reinforcement. Fixed ratio schedule. Reinforcement occurs after a fixed number of responses have been emitted since the previous reinforcement. Variable ratio schedule. Reinforcement occurs after a variable number of responses have been emitted since the previous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement. Reinforcement occurs after each response. Discrimination, generalization and context. Most behavior is under stimulus control. Several aspects of this may be distinguished. Discrimination typically occurs when a response is reinforced only in the presence of a specific stimulus. For example, a pigeon might be fed for pecking at a red light and not at a green light. In consequence, it pecks at red and stops pecking at green. Many complex combinations of stimuli and other conditions have been studied. For example, an organism might be reinforced on an interval schedule in the presence of one stimulus and on a ratio schedule in the presence of another. Generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to a previously trained discriminative stimulus. For example, having been trained to peck at red, a pigeon might also peck at pink, though usually less strongly. Context refers to stimuli that are continuously present in a situation, like the walls, tables, chairs, etc., in a room, or the interior of an operant conditioning chamber. Context stimuli may come to control behavior as do discriminative stimuli, though usually more weakly. Behaviors learned in one context may be absent or altered in another. This may cause difficulties for behavioral therapy, because behaviors learned in the therapeutic setting may fail to occur elsewhere. Operant hoarding. Operant hoarding refers to the observation that rats reinforced in a certain way may allow food pellets to accumulate in a food tray instead of retrieving those pellets. In this procedure, retrieval of the pellets always instituted a 1-minute period of extinction during which no additional food pellets were available, but those that had been accumulated earlier could be consumed. This finding appears to contradict the usual finding that rats behave impulsively in situations in which there is a choice between a smaller food object right away and a larger food object after some delay. See schedules of reinforcement. Operant conditioning to change human behavior. Applied behavior analysis is the discipline initiated by B.F. Skinner that applies the principles of conditioning to the modification of socially significant human behavior. It uses the basic concepts of conditioning theory, including conditioned stimulus, discriminative stimulus response, and reinforcing stimulus. The conditioned stimulus controls behaviors developed through respondent conditioning, such as emotional reactions. The other three terms combine to form Skinner's three-term contingency. A discriminative stimulus sets the occasion for responses that lead to reinforcement. Researchers have found the following protocol to be effective when they use the tools of operant conditioning to modify human behavior. State goal: clarify exactly what changes are to be brought about. For example, reduce weight by 30 pounds. Monitor behavior. Keep track of behavior so that one can see whether the desired effects are occurring. For example, keep a chart of daily weights. Reinforce desired behavior. For example, congratulate the individual on weight losses. With humans, a record of behavior may serve as a reinforcement. For example, when a participant sees a pattern of weight loss, this may reinforce continuance in a behavioral weight loss program. A more general plan is the token economy, an exchange system in which tokens are given as rewards for desired behaviors. Tokens may later be exchanged for a desired prize or rewards such as power, prestige, goods or services. Reduce incentives to perform undesirable behavior. For example, remove candy and fatty snacks from kitchen shelves. Neurobiological correlates of operant conditioning. The first scientific studies identifying neurons that responded in ways that suggested they encode for conditioned stimuli came from work by Marlon DeLong and by R.T. Richardson. They showed that nucleus basalis neurons, which release acetylcholine broadly throughout the cerebral cortex, are activated shortly after a conditioned stimulus, or after a primary reward if no conditioned stimulus exists. These neurons are equally active for positive and negative reinforcers, and have been shown to be related to neuroplasticity in many cortical regions. Evidence also exists that dopamine is activated at similar times. There is considerable evidence that dopamine participates in both reinforcement and aversive learning. Dopamine pathways project much more densely onto frontal cortex regions. Cholinergic projections, in contrast, are dense even in the posterior cortical regions like the primary visual cortex. A study of patients with Parkinson's disease, a condition attributed to the insufficient action of dopamine, further illustrates the role of dopamine in positive reinforcement. It showed that while off the medication, patients learned more readily with aversive consequences than with positive reinforcement. Patients who were on the medication showed the opposite to be the case, positive reinforcement proving to be the more effective form of learning when dopamine activity is high. A neurochemical process involving dopamine has been suggested to underlie reinforcement. When an organism experiences a reinforcing stimulus, dopamine pathways in the brain are activated. This network of pathways releases a short pulse of dopamine onto many dendrites, thus broadcasting a rather global reinforcement signal to postsynaptic neurons. This allows recently activated synapses to increase the sensitivity to efferent signals, thus increasing the probability of occurrence for the recent responses that preceded the reinforcement. These responses are, statistically, the most likely to have been the behavior responsible for successfully achieving reinforcement. But when the application of reinforcement is either less immediate or less contingent, the ability of dopamine to act upon the appropriate synapses is reduced.